Picture this: you wake up one morning, and before you even take your first bite of bread, you have to consider whether the food might be cursed. You glance at your neighbor, wondering if their sudden good fortune means they've made a deal with dark forces. And as you step outside, the very air feels charged with invisible threats: demons, omens, the wrath of saints. This wasn't the plot of a fantasy novel. This was reality for people living in the Middle Ages. Their world was steeped in beliefs that shaped every action, from the mundane to the monumental. Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to uncover 22 medieval beliefs that ruled daily life. Ideas so powerful they dictated what people ate, how they healed, who they trusted, and even when they dared to leave their homes. These weren't just superstitions, they were the framework of society. Think about it. In a time before science could explain disease or weather, people turned to whatever made sense to them. A sudden illness must be a witch's curse, a failed harvest, the gods are displeased. The line between faith and fact was blurred, and these beliefs became the rules everyone lived by. Some were rooted in religion, others in folklore, but all of them had one thing in common: they held unimaginable sway over the choices people made. And here's the thing: while we might dismiss these ideas today, they weren't just random fears. They were survival strategies, ways to make sense of a chaotic and often unforgiving world. So why does this matter now? Because these beliefs didn't just vanish, they left echoes. Some evolved into traditions we still recognize. Others shaped the way societies organized themselves for centuries. And when you start to understand them, you begin to see how deeply human nature drives us to seek explanations, to find patterns even in the unknown. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through the most fascinating, surprising, and sometimes downright bizarre beliefs that guided medieval lives. You'll discover why people carried rabbit's feet for luck, how a simple sneeze could spell disaster, and why the wrong kind of glance might land you in serious trouble. This isn't just history, it's a window into how people navigate fear, hope, and the unknown. Ready to step into their world? Let's begin. Religion wasn't just a part of life in the Middle Ages, it was life. Every sunrise, every meal, every breath carried the weight of faith. Picture a world where the church bell didn't just mark time but shaped it, telling farmers when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. The rhythm of daily life pulsed to a divine beat. Even the simplest tasks, baking bread, building a fence, even sweeping the floor, could be acts of worship or defiance, depending on how they were done. Take something as ordinary as the weather. Today, we check forecasts on our phones, but medieval peasants looked to the heavens literally. A sudden storm wasn't just bad luck, it was a sign of God's displeasure. Droughts, punishment for collective sin; a bumper crop, divine favor. People didn't just pray for rain, they fasted, held processions, even paraded relics through fields, begging for mercy. And the priest wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was the town's first call during crises, whether illness struck or wolves prowled too close to the village. Then there were the rituals. Before a merchant set off on a journey, he'd have his pack blessed. A mother in labor clutched a saint's relic for protection. Even contracts were signed in the shadow of the church, because breaking a sworn oath wasn't just dishonest, it was an offense against God. And here's what's fascinating: these weren't empty gestures. People truly believed divine forces were at work in every detail. A poorly timed sneeze could be an omen. A dream might be a message from the saints. The line between the sacred and the everyday was so thin, it barely existed. But it wasn't just about fear or superstition. Faith provided order in a chaotic world. The liturgical calendar gave structure to the year: Lent for repentance, Easter for renewal, saints' days for celebration. The church fed the hungry, sheltered travelers, even settled disputes. In a time before hospitals, monks and nuns were the healers, mixing prayer with herbs in ways that blurred medicine and miracle. And when disaster struck, people didn't just despair. They turned to penance, processions, and vows, convinced their actions could sway the heavens. This wasn't blind devotion, it was a survival strategy. In a world where life hung by a thread, a plague, famine, war, faith was the thread. It explained the unexplainable, offered hope in the bleakest moments, and bound communities together. Even the harshest punishments, like excommunication, weren't just spiritual threats. To be cast out of the church meant being cut off from society itself. No trade, no marriage, no protection. Religion wasn't just a belief system. It was the glue holding the medieval world together. And yet, for all its power, the church wasn't monolithic. Peasants might pray to local saints ignored by Rome, while scholars debated theology in ways that would have shocked their congregations. Pilgrims traveled miles to touch a saint's bones, believing their power could cure ailments or grant miracles. Even the architecture of cathedrals, towering, luminous, was designed to humble and awe, reminding everyone of their place in a vast divine plan. What's striking is how these beliefs trickled into every corner of life. The fear of hell wasn't abstract. It shaped laws, inspired art, and even dictated fashion. Sumptuary laws controlled who could wear silk or fur, not just to enforce class but to curb vanity, a sin that might bring God's wrath. Festivals like Carnival flipped the social order for a day, but only under the church's watchful eye. Even timekeeping revolved around prayer. Monks divided the day into canonical hours, their chants marking the passage of time long before clocks did. So when we talk about medieval religion, we're not just talking about Sunday services. We're talking about a world view where every action, from the grand to the mundane, was threaded with meaning. A spilled cup of wine wasn't just clumsiness, it might be a portent. A child's fever wasn't just illness, it could be a test of faith. This was a world where the divine wasn't distant. It was in the soil, the sky, the very air people breathed. And that belief didn't just shape lives, it built civilizations. Imagine living in a world where questioning your ruler wasn't just dangerous, it was a sin. That was the reality under the doctrine of the divine right of kings, a belief so powerful it turned monarchs into something more than human. These rulers weren't merely political leaders, they were handpicked by God himself, their authority woven into the very fabric of the universe. To challenge them wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy, a direct insult to divine order. This idea didn't just keep kings on their thrones, it shaped entire societies. Take the coronation ceremony, for example. Unlike modern leaders who might swear an oath to their people, medieval monarchs were anointed with holy oil, a ritual echoing biblical kings like David and Solomon. This wasn't symbolism, it was transformation. The moment the oil touched their skin, they became God's living instruments, their words carrying the weight of heaven. Even their touch was believed to hold miraculous power, with kings like those of England and France performing the royal touch to cure diseases like scrofula, known as the king's evil. Crowds would line up for miles, convinced the monarch's hands could channel divine healing. But what happened when a king was cruel or incompetent? That's where the belief became a double-edged sword. People might grumble about taxes or unfair laws, but outright rebellion was rare. Why? Because if a king ruled badly, it was seen as God's punishment for the people's sins, not the king's failure. The thought of overthrowing him was terrifying. What if God had placed that ruler there for a reason? What if rebellion brought even worse divine wrath? This fear kept even tyrants in power for years. When revolts did happen, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, leaders framed their demands carefully, often claiming they were loyal to the king but fighting his corrupt advisors. To accuse the king directly was to risk damnation. The church played a crucial role in upholding this belief. Bishops preached sermons comparing kings to Old Testament prophets, while royal decrees were read from pulpits as if they were scripture. Art reinforced the message. 2 paintings showed angels crowning monarchs, and tapestries depicted rulers alongside saints. Even the architecture of palaces and cathedrals was designed to awe, with towering thrones placed so the king sat literally above everyone else, bathed in light from stained glass. Yet this belief wasn't monolithic. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas argued that while kings had divine authority, they still had to rule justly, hinting that tyranny might justify resistance. But for most people, the idea stuck. A king's power came from God, and that was that. This doctrine didn't just justify monarchy, it created a world where social hierarchy felt eternal, where peasants bowed not just to a man but to a cosmic order. And that mindset lasted for centuries, shaping laws, wars, and even the way people understood their place in the world. What's fascinating is how this belief echoes even today. Modern democracies may have rejected divine right, but traces remain. Think of presidential oaths on Bibles or the way leaders still invoke God's will in speeches. The medieval world may seem distant, but its ideas about power, legitimacy, and authority still linger in ways we might not even notice. Now imagine walking through a medieval village where a single glance could ruin lives. Not a glare of anger or a look of envy, just an ordinary stare held a moment too long. That was the terror of the evil eye, a belief so pervasive it shaped friendships, fueled court cases, and inspired countless charms to ward off its invisible danger. To medieval people, misfortune wasn't random. It was the work of human eyes channeling dark forces, often unintentionally. A neighbor admiring your healthy baby. That compliment might hide a curse, a stranger lingering near your wheat field. Next week's blight could be traced back to that moment. The fear wasn't baseless to them. When a child suddenly fell ill or milk soured overnight, the evil eye offered an explanation and a target. Protective measures ranged from simple to elaborate. Mothers pinned coral amulets to their children's clothing, the red hue thought to repel malice. Farmers hung crescent-shaped charms over barn doors, symbols echoing older pagan traditions. Even architecture played a role. Doorways in some regions were built crooked because a winding path was believed to confuse and trap harmful gazes. But the most striking consequence: how this superstition bled into law. Court records from places like 14th century England show accusations of fascination, the formal term for evil eye curses. One case involved a woman whose rivals stared at her pigs before they died. Another accused a beggar of withering crops with a glance. These weren't fringe claims. Communities took them seriously because in a world without germ theory or meteorology, the evil eye filled the gaps. It turned chaos into cause and effect, giving people someone or something to blame. What's revealing is who often bore the brunt of suspicion. Outsiders, travelers, beggars, unmarried women were frequent targets, their difference making them lightning rods for fear. A widow with knowledge of herbs might be praised as a healer one day, accused of cursing livestock the next. This wasn't just paranoia. It reflected a deeper anxiety about unseen threats in a precarious world. When life hung by threads, a bad harvest, a fever, a stillbirth, the evil eye gave misfortune a face. Yet there's irony here. The same communities that feared the evil eye also harnessed its power. In parts of Italy, people believed red horn amulets could reflect curses back to the sender. Scottish fishermen painted their boats with staring eyes, turning the symbol of danger into a talisman of protection. Even the act of spitting, seen as vulgar today, was a shield. Quick, discreet spits after a compliment were thought to neutralize envy's poison. This belief wasn't just medieval, it was ancient, stretching back to Babylonian incantations and Greek texts. But in the Middle Ages, it took on new urgency, blending with Christian teachings about sin and demonic influence. Priests might dismiss pagan charms but still warn against envy as one of the deadly sins. The line between superstition and doctrine blurred, creating a world where faith and folklore worked hand in hand to explain suffering. What's heartbreaking is how ordinary these fears were. A mother kissing her child's forehead to seal them from harm. A farmer hiding his best seeds to avoid jealous eyes. These weren't acts of hysteria, but of love. In a time before insurance or medicine, rituals were the only safety nets people had. The evil eye myth reveals something profound about human nature, our need to name the unnamed, to fight back against forces we can't see or control. And in that struggle, even a glance could become a weapon. To understand the medieval obsession with relics, you have to imagine a world where heaven felt tantalizingly close, almost within reach. A sliver of wood claimed to be from Christ's cross, a tooth said to belong to St. Peter, a drop of the Virgin Mary's milk preserved in a vial. These weren't just curiosities. They were bridges between the earthly and the divine, physical proof that the sacred could touch the mundane. For people who'd never see a miracle firsthand, relics made the impossible tangible. Take the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, where the bones of St. James drew 500,000 visitors each year. The journey itself was grueling, months on foot, braving bandits, disease, and treacherous weather. Yet pilgrims kept coming, convinced that reaching those relics would erase years of sin or cure incurable ailments. Some walked barefoot as penance, others carried loved ones on their backs, hoping a saint's intercession might restore sight or mend broken limbs. The roads to these holy sites became medieval highways, lined with inns, markets, and even hospitals built solely to serve the faithful. But relics weren't just spiritual treasures, they were economic powerhouses. Cities competed fiercely to acquire them, knowing a single saint's bone could transform a sleepy town into a thriving destination. Venice stole St. Mark's body from Alexandria, smuggling it under layers of pork to deter Muslim inspectors. Constantinople boasted enough relics to fill a catalogue: thorns from Christ's crown, Moses' staff, even the very nails used in the crucifixion. Churches displayed these objects in lavish reliquaries, some crafted from gold and jewels worth kingdoms, because the more magnificent the container, the greater the relic's perceived power. The trade in fakes flourished too. With demand so high, enterprising merchants sold authentic fragments of Noah's Ark or feathers from the Holy Spirit. One abbey claimed to have John the Baptist's entire head until another church made the same claim. Rather than causing doubt, this duplication only deepened belief. If a relic could miraculously multiply, wasn't that proof of its holiness? What's revealing is how relics blurred the line between religion and daily survival. Farmers rubbed saintly bones on fields to ensure good harvests. Kings carried relics into battle, believing they'd guarantee victory. Even law courts used them, swearing an oath on a relic made testimony unbreakable because lying risked divine wrath. These objects weren't passive. They were active participants in medieval life, wielded like spiritual tools. Pilgrim badges, cheaply made and sold at shrines, tell another story. These tin or lead souvenirs imprinted with images of saints or sacred sites weren't just mementos. Worn on hats or cloaks, they turned pilgrims into walking advertisements, sparking conversations that spread a shrine's fame further. They also served as proof of completion, like medieval passport stamps, granting social status back home. The legacy of this belief still lingers. Modern tourists flock to sites like Lourdes or Fatima, seeking healing or renewal. The Vatican's treasury still displays relics, and cathedrals market pilgrimage routes to this day. It's a testament to an idea that shaped centuries, that the divine isn't distant but something you can touch, carry, even walk toward, one painful, hopeful step at a time. Imagine a storm flattening your village the night after an argument with your neighbor, or your child falling feverish days after a wandering healer passed through town. In the Middle Ages, these weren't just tragedies, they were evidence that someone had harnessed dark forces to bring ruin upon you. Witchcraft wasn't folklore, it was the go-to explanation for any unexplained suffering, and the accused weren't always cackling hags from storybooks. They were often ordinary people, midwives with too much knowledge, loners who kept to themselves, even children caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If bad things happened, someone must have willed them. A cow's milk drying up, witchcraft. A stillbirth, witchcraft. Even hailstorms or failed marriages could be pinned on a hidden enemy's malice. What made these accusations stick wasn't proof, but the sheer desperation for answers in a world where science couldn't explain misfortune. And once suspicion took root, it spread like wildfire. Take the case of the Bamberg witch trials in 17th century Germany. Over 1,000 people, men, women, even the town's wealthiest citizens, were executed based on confessions extracted through torture. Their crimes, allegedly causing frosts that killed crops or summoning storms to sink ships. Under pain, they named others, creating a chain reaction that emptied entire neighborhoods. What's chilling is how routine it became. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, laid out step-by-step guides for identifying and prosecuting witches, turning fear into a bureaucratic process. But why did certain people become targets? Sometimes it was as trivial as a physical trait. A birthmark could be labeled the devil's mark, a sign of satanic pacts. Red hair, left-handedness, or even an unusual skill, like a knack for healing, could spark suspicion. Other times it was about power. Widows who inherited property, outspoken women who challenged norms, or outsiders who didn't conform to village life were vulnerable. The witch hunts weren't just about superstition. They were tools for enforcing social order, silencing dissent, or seizing assets. The trials themselves were grotesque spectacles of injustice. Swimming tests bound accused witches and threw them into water. If they floated a sign of the devil's influence, they were guilty. If they sank, and often drowned, they were innocent. Needle pricks searched for spots that didn't bleed, proof of a witch's supernatural immunity, and the sheer scale of the hunts is staggering. In regions like Trier and Fulda, entire villages were left nearly empty after mass executions. What's often overlooked is how these beliefs persisted because they served a purpose. Blaming a witch gave communities a scapegoat, a way to process grief and rage without confronting the randomness of disease or bad weather. It also reinforced moral boundaries: behave piously or risk being accused. Even the church, which initially dismissed witchcraft as peasant nonsense, eventually embraced the panic, using it to root out heresy and consolidate control. The legacy of these hunts is darker than we admit. They weren't just medieval, they bled into the Enlightenment. The Salem trials happened in 1692, closer to the invention of the steam engine than to the construction of Notre Dame. And the psychology behind them isn't ancient history. When fear grips a society, the urge to find someone to blame never really disappears. The witch hunts remind us how easily justice can warp into persecution when people crave certainty more than truth. Imagine going to a medieval doctor with a fever, only to be told your treatment couldn't start until Mars aligned with Jupiter. This wasn't a stall tactic, it was standard practice. In the Middle Ages, astrology wasn't just for fortune-telling. It was the cornerstone of medicine. Physicians carried elaborate star charts alongside their surgical tools, convinced that the movements of planets directly influenced everything from fevers to fractures. A headache wasn't just a headache, it was a sign of Mercury's influence, and the cure depended on which constellation ruled the hour. Take bloodletting, the era's go-to remedy. Today, we'd call it dangerous pseudoscience, but medieval doctors approached it with precision worthy of a modern operating room. They wouldn't just open a vein, they'd wait for the moon to be in Pisces, believed to govern the body's fluids, or avoid Aries, linked to the head if treating a migraine. Manuscripts like the Tacuinum Sanatotis laid out exact astrological timings for procedures, warning that a misaligned planet could turn healing into harm. Even herbal remedies followed cosmic rules. Rosemary picked under a full moon was thought to carry stronger curative powers, while feverfew harvested during a solar eclipse might poison the patient instead of curing them. The reasoning behind this wasn't pure superstition, it was an attempt to systemize the unknown. Medieval scholars saw the universe as a vast, interconnected machine. If the moon could pull oceans into tides, why wouldn't it sway the fluids in a human body? This logic extended to the zodiac's link to anatomy. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the throat, Gemini the arms. A surgeon treating a shoulder wound might delay cutting until the sun left Gemini, fearing heightened bleeding. What's fascinating is how seriously even educated elites took this. Universities like Bologna and Paris taught medical astrology as rigorously as anatomy. Kings employed court astrologer physicians, and the wealthy paid extra for elective surgeries scheduled during auspicious alignments. When Charles VI of France descended into madness, his doctors blamed planetary configurations, not psychology, but this system had grim consequences. Imagine dying from a treatable infection because the right planetary hour was weeks away, or consider the suffering of patients subjected to repeated bloodlettings under favorable stars while their conditions worsened. The reliance on astrology often delayed or distorted care, prioritizing celestial charts over visible symptoms. Yet there's a twisted logic here. In a world without germ theory or X-rays, astrology offered a framework flawed but structured to navigate the chaos of illness. It gave physicians the illusion of control, a way to say, we're not guessing, we're calculating. And in rare cases, it might have even helped. Delaying a risky procedure during a hostile alignment could accidentally spare patients from infection-ridden summer surgeries. The legacy of this belief lingers in unexpected ways. Modern words like influenza come from the medieval idea that diseases flowed from celestial influences. Even today's medical symbols, the caduceus with its entwined snakes, echo ancient astrological imagery linking healing to cosmic balance. While we've traded star charts for stethoscopes, the human urge to find patterns in suffering hasn't disappeared. We just call those patterns risk factors instead of planetary alignments. You wake up with a pounding headache in the Middle Ages, and your doctor doesn't ask about your sleep or stress, he asks about your bile. To medieval physicians, illness wasn't caused by viruses or bacteria, but by an invisible battle raging inside your body, a war between four fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant keeping these fluids perfectly balanced, and sickness meant one had gained the upper hand. This wasn't just medical theory, it shaped everything from diets to surgeries, even the way people understood their own personalities. Think of it like an ancient thermostat. Too much blood, you were hot, impulsive, prone to fever, what they called sanguine. The cure, bleeding, often with leeches to cool you down. Too much phlegm, you were sluggish, cold, phlegmatic, a time for spicy foods to heat you up. Black bile made you melancholic, brooding and sad, while yellow bile turned you choleric, quick-tempered and fiery. These weren't just labels, they were diagnoses dictating treatments that could last for weeks. The influence of humoral theory went far beyond medicine. It shaped what people ate because food was classified by its effect on the humors. Want to counteract too much black bile? Avoid cold, dry foods like lentils and opt for moist, warm dishes like figs or chicken. Even the seasons played a role. Spring was blood-heavy, so physicians warned against overexcitement, while winter's phlegm called for extra spices to stoke internal heat. But the most surprising legacy, how these ideas defined personalities. Writers like Shakespeare leaned on humoral types to craft characters. Think of the moody Hamlet, melancholic, or the hot-headed Hotspur, choleric. Matchmaking guides even used humors to predict compatibility. A fiery choleric man might be told to marry a cool phlegmatic woman to balance their temperaments. The treatments, though, could be brutal. Bloodletting wasn't just a quick pinprick. Some patients were drained until they fainted, believed to reset the humors. Purging via vomit-inducing herbs or laxatives was common for yellow bile imbalances. Yet there were flashes of insight too. Medieval doctors noticed that certain moods accompanied illnesses, laying early groundwork for psychosomatic medicine. And the idea of balance, it wasn't entirely wrong, just misdirected. What's haunting is how long this belief persisted. Well into the 1800s, doctors still prescribed leeches, and terms like melancholy linger in our language. The humors remind us how desperately humans seek systems to explain the body's chaos, even when those systems rest on something as fragile as the idea that your sadness might just be too much black bile. Picture a merchant in medieval Florence, desperate to expand his textile trade, but unable to borrow coins without committing what the church called a mortal sin. This was the paradox of usury, a belief so powerful it reshaped economies, redirected fortunes, and forced people to devise ingenious workarounds just to keep commerce alive. To charge interest on a loan wasn't just frowned upon, it was condemned as greed masquerading as business, a violation of Christian charity that could land you in hell. The Bible was clear: lend, expecting nothing in return, but human nature and the growing complexity of trade was even clearer. Money, like water, always finds a way to flow. The roots of this belief ran deep. Early church fathers like Augustine argued that money itself was barren. It couldn't breed more money through interest. To profit from someone else's hardship was to exploit Christ's command to love thy neighbor. By the 13th century, popes had declared usury a sin punishable by excommunication, and Dante placed usurers in the seventh circle of hell, their hands eternally burning as they clutched bags of gold. But here's where it gets complicated. Medieval society still needed loans. Farmers required seed money before harvests. Merchants needed capital for voyages. Even kings had to fund wars. So how did people sidestep divine wrath? Through creativity bordering on legal fiction. Jewish moneylenders, exempt from Christian prohibitions, became essential, though this also fueled dangerous anti-Semitic stereotypes. Italian bankers developed the cambium, a system where interest was disguised as currency exchange rates or late fees. Others gave gifts instead of demanding interest, relying on social pressure to ensure repayment. The most cunning workaround, the societas, where lenders became temporary business partners, sharing profits and risks to avoid the taint of usury. The consequences rippled far beyond theology. Usury laws inadvertently strengthened communal bonds. Monasteries lent interest-free to the poor, and guilds pooled resources for members in need. But they also stifled innovation. Without reliable credit, large-scale ventures like overseas exploration or industrial projects often stalled. Even the construction of cathedrals, those marvels of medieval engineering, relied on donations and indulgences rather than loans. Yet the tension between faith and finance couldn't last forever. As trade expanded, even the church softened. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas carved out exceptions, allowing compensation for lost profits or risk. By the late Middle Ages, the Medici family was building a banking empire with papal blessing, proving that money, like morality, was never black and white. What's fascinating is how this ancient debate echoes today. Modern credit cards charge interest rates that would have scandalized medieval clerics, yet we still wrestle with payday lenders and predatory loans. The medieval fear wasn't just about greed, it was about fairness, about whether profit should ever come from another's desperation. And in that concern, 700 years haven't changed a thing. A handshake in the Middle Ages wasn't just a gesture, it was a potential life sentence. When two people swore an oath, they weren't just making a promise, they were weaving their souls together under God's watchful eye. This wasn't mere formality. An oath breaker didn't just lose trust, they risked eternal damnation, social exile, and in some cases, even physical mutilation. The weight of a single vow could determine the fate of kingdoms, the survival of families, and the very order of daily life. Take the feudal system, built entirely on sworn bonds. A vassal kneeling before his lord wasn't just offering loyalty, he was pledging his body, crops, and future heirs in exchange for protection. These oaths were sealed with relics. A knight might swear on a fragment of the true cross, a merchant on a saint's bone. To break such a vow wasn't just dishonorable, it was sacrilege. Historical records show lords stripping lands from oath breakers, not just as punishment but as spiritual necessity, to keep a betrayer's corruption from tainting the land itself. But oaths didn't just govern nobles. In villages, business deals were sealed not with contracts but with verbal vows before witnesses. A baker promising to deliver bread weekly, a farmer pledging part of his harvest. These agreements held force because everyone believed divine justice would punish deceit. Courts relied on oath helpers, neighbors who'd swear to a person's honesty, their collective word carrying more weight than written evidence. Fail to keep your oath. You might face the ordeal of hot iron, walking barefoot over burning coals to prove your innocence, a test less about truth and more about divine intervention. The consequences of broken vows extended beyond the law. Guilds blacklisted dishonest members, effectively ending their livelihoods. Families disowned relatives who betrayed marriage oaths, with annulments granted only in rare cases like proven impotence, and even then, the accused might undergo humiliating public inspections. The infamous rough music rituals saw communities shaming oath breakers with cacophonous parades, banging pots and pans outside their homes until they fled in disgrace. Yet for all their severity, oaths had loopholes. Clever wording could create escape hatches like vassals pledging loyalty, save for my allegiance to the king, leaving room to rebel if their lord defied the crown. The church, too, navigated gray areas. Priests absolved crusaders of earlier vows if they took the cross, swapping one sacred promise for another. Even the Magna Carta, that cornerstone of rights, was essentially a web of oaths between King John and his barons, its power rooted in the belief that divine wrath would strike whoever violated it. What's striking is how this belief mirrored medieval society's fragility. Without widespread literacy or centralized law, oaths were the glue holding everything together. They turned vague loyalties into enforceable bonds, made strangers trust each other, and gave even the poorest serf a weapon against exploitation, the threat of God's judgment. The fear wasn't abstract. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, many saw it as divine retribution for collective oath-breaking, sparking waves of public penance. The echoes linger today. We still swear on Bibles in court, exchange rings in weddings, and recoil at the idea of going back on your word. The medieval world simply took what we call integrity and wrapped it in fire and brimstone, turning social contracts into matters of eternal consequence. In an era where a handshake could damn or redeem you, every promise was quite literally a deal with heaven. Imagine living in a town where your neighbor's private thoughts could doom you all. That was the terrifying logic behind medieval Europe's war on heresy, a belief so potent it turned theological disagreements into crimes punishable by fire. To challenge church doctrine wasn't just intellectual dissent, it was treason against God, a contagion that risked divine punishment for entire cities. When crops failed or plague struck, people didn't blame bad luck, they asked, "Who among us has angered heaven?" The church's definition of heresy was broad enough to ensnare almost anyone. Waldensians who preached poverty as a virtue, Cathars who rejected materialism, even scholars questioning details of transubstantiation, all were branded threats. But why such extreme fear? Because medieval society saw itself as a single body, the body of Christ, where one rotten limb could infect the whole. A heretic wasn't just wrong, they were a spiritual arsonist, risking hellfire for everyone. This wasn't metaphor. Chronicles described townsfolk panicking when rumors of heresy spread, convinced their homes would be next to burn under God's wrath. Enter the Inquisition, a system as bureaucratic as it was brutal. Contrary to popular myth, it wasn't just about torture and stakes. Inquisitors meticulously documented trials, offering accused heretics chances to repent not from mercy, but because confession purified the community. Those who recanted faced humiliating penances, wearing yellow crosses for life, making pilgrimages barefoot, or surrendering property to the church. Only the unrepentant burned, their executions framed as tragic necessities to protect the faithful. The Albigensian crusade against the Cathars reveals how heresy fears could escalate into genocide. When papal legates failed to convert the dualist Christians of southern France, knights were promised salvation for slaughter. At Béziers in 1209, soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics. The chilling reply, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Thousands died, and the message was clear. Theological unity mattered more than human life. Yet heresy trials also exposed the Church's deepest anxieties. When the mystic Marguerite Porete was burned in 1310 for writing that love could replace religious rituals, her real crime was bypassing priestly authority. The Lollards' English Bible translations threatened Latin's monopoly on scripture. Every execution wasn't just about eliminating ideas. It was about maintaining control over how people experienced the divine. What's often overlooked is how these persecutions reshaped societies. Fear of accusation made neighbors spy on each other. Children denounced parents for suspicious bedtime prayers. Inquisitors encouraged this, offering lighter sentences for informants. The result, a culture of surveillance where conformity became survival. Even dying wasn't an escape. Exhumed bones of dead heretics could be burned, their heirs disinherited. But resistance simmered beneath the surface. Some villages hid accused heretics, valuing community over dogma. Fake converts crossed themselves with subtle gestures to signal hidden beliefs. And in a bitter twist, the Church's obsession with heresy inadvertently preserved dissenters' voices. Detailed trial records now serve as rare windows into medieval alternate Christianities. The legacy of this fear still whispers today. The very word heresy carries weight, used to describe ideological betrayals in politics or science. It reminds us how easily societies can weaponize unity, turning difference into danger, and how often those who claim to act for heaven's sake bring hell to earth. In medieval Europe, the calendar didn't just mark time, it pulsed with divine purpose. Every sunrise belonged to a saint, their feast days threading through the year like sacred fence posts, separating the ordinary from the holy. Forget checking the weather before planting wheat. What mattered was whether it was St. Urban's Day or St. Medard's, because sowing seeds on the wrong date could mean the difference between a full granary and a barren field. Time itself was a tapestry of blessings and curses, woven by the lives of long-dead martyrs and miracle workers. Take St. Swithin's Day in England. If rain fell on July 15th, tradition claimed it would pour for 40 more days, a belief so stubborn it outlasted centuries. Farmers planned harvests around it, travelers delayed journeys, and even lovers postponed weddings, all because one 9th century bishop's weather curse lingered in collective memory. Meanwhile, in France, no fisherman would dare set sail on St. Peter's Day, fearing the patron of fishermen might retaliate for their audacity by stirring up storms. These weren't quaint customs, they were survival strategies, ways to align human effort with celestial favor. The saints' influence stretched into every chore. Blacksmiths avoided working on St. Eligius' feast day, honoring their patron by letting anvils cool. Bakers saved their best loaves for St. Honoré, praying for protection against burnt crusts. Even mundane tasks like shearing sheep or pruning vines had their holy schedules. St. Agnes for lamb's wool, St. Vincent for vineyards. Miss the date, and you risked more than bad luck. You offended invisible guardians who could blight your livelihood. But the power of these dates went deeper than superstition. Saints' days structured society itself. Markets clustered around feast days, drawing crowds to towns hosting relic processions. Contracts stipulated payment terms like by St. John's Mass, turning religious events into legal deadlines. Serfs knew which saint's day marked when rents were due, and sailors tracked voyages by the feast days they'd celebrated at sea. The liturgical calendar wasn't just spiritual, it was the medieval equivalent of Google Calendar, coordinating everything from commerce to courtship. What's revealing is how these traditions bent time to human needs. When the Church declared St. Joseph's Day in March a break from Lent's austerity, it wasn't just piety, it was practical. Winter stores were running low, and people needed one sanctioned feast to bolster morale. Similarly, moving saints' days to overlap with pagan festivals like St. Bridget, replacing the Celtic goddess Brigid, helped convert communities by grafting new beliefs onto old rhythms. The legacy of this belief lingers in plain sight. Ever wonder why Groundhog Day echoes weather prophecies? It falls on Candlemas, a medieval feast predicting winter's end. Our modern bank holidays descend from saints' days when debts were forgiven. Even the frantic pace of Christmas shopping traces back to Advent's quiet weeks, giving way to St. Nicholas' generosity. The medieval world didn't just honor saints, it lived by their rhythms, turning time itself into a conversation with the divine. Death in the Middle Ages wasn't a one-way journey. It was more like a spiritual toll booth where souls queued, waiting to pay off their sins. Purgatory wasn't just a concept, it was a vivid, terrifying reality for medieval Christians. Picture a place not quite hell but far from heaven, where flames licked away imperfections for years, decades, even centuries. The catch: the living could shorten a soul's suffering through prayers, alms, and cold, hard cash. This belief didn't just haunt dreams, it built cathedrals, funded wars, and reshaped entire economies. The mechanics were simple yet terrifying. Every sin, from gossip to greed, carried a temporal penalty, a debt that had to be settled before a soul could enter paradise. Minor sins might mean a few hundred years in purgatory's fires. Major ones could stretch into millennia. But here's where the system got creative. The church taught that the living could transfer merit to the dead through good works. A son could recite psalms for his father's soul, a widow could donate bread to the poor in her husband's name, and most controversially, the wealthy could purchase indulgences, essentially buying time off a loved one's sentence. Indulgences weren't coupons for salvation, they were meticulously calculated. A papal bull in 1343 offered a year's reduction for visiting Rome's churches during Jubilee. By the 1500s, hawkers like Johann Tetzel peddled them with jingles. When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from Purgatory springs. The math became absurdly precise. One bishop claimed his relics could shave 20,000 years off a soul's stay. The underlying message was clear. Salvation had a price tag, and the church held the ledger. But this wasn't just about money. Purgatory transformed grief into action. Chantries, small chapels where priests recited endless masses for the dead, sprang up across Europe. Wealthy families endowed them in perpetuity, ensuring their ancestors wouldn't be forgotten. The poor pooled pennies for communal soul lights, candles kept burning to guide the departed. Even the dying planned ahead, leaving bequests for post-mortem prayers in their wills. A 13th century merchant's will from Siena lists exact sums: 10 florins for the Dominicans to sing masses, 5 for the Franciscans, 2 for the local leper colony, every coin a stepping stone toward heaven. The economic ripple effects were staggering. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica was bankrolled by indulgent sales. Monasteries grew fat on bequests tied to prayers. Meanwhile, the fear of being forgotten, of languishing in purgatory because no one paid for masses, drove artistic innovation. Cadaver tombs depicted rotting corpses as reminders. What you are, I once was. What I am, you will be. The wealthy commissioned memento mori art, skulls and hourglasses whispering, don't stop praying. Yet purgatory also bred dissent. Reformers like Wycliffe and Luther raged against the commodification of grace, arguing salvation couldn't be bought. The backlash ignited the Reformation, but even Protestants couldn't shake the underlying dread. Puritan sermons still warned of waiting souls, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation doubled down, making purgatory dogma in 1563. What's haunting is how this belief turned love into currency. A peasant scraping together coins for his mother's indulgence wasn't just gullible, he was desperate to spare her pain. The widow lighting a candle wasn't superstitious, she was keeping vigil across the veil of death. Purgatory didn't just profit from fear, it gave grief a language, a way to say, I haven't let you go. In an age without photographs or voice recordings, it kept the dead vividly present, their fates literally in the hands of the living. The echoes linger today. Ever toss a coin into a fountain and make a wish? That's purgatory's distant cousin, the hope that small acts can sway unseen forces. Modern funeral customs, from obituaries to memorial donations, carry traces of that medieval urge to do something for the departed, the difference. Today's rituals soothe the living. Back then, people truly believed they were pulling souls from fire, one prayer at a time. Dreams in the Middle Ages weren't private thoughts, they were urgent dispatches from the divine. A king tossing in his bed might wake to cancel an entire military campaign because his dream showed ravens circling the battlefield. A merchant's daughter could refuse a wealthy suitor after dreaming of a serpent coiled around her wrist. These weren't whims, they were warnings, prophecies, and sometimes outright commands. In a world where the veil between earthly and spiritual realms felt thin, sleep became a sacred space where heaven and hell whispered directly into human ears. The weight given to dreams wasn't arbitrary. Ancient texts like Artemidorus Onera Critica, translated and treasured by medieval scholars, laid out elaborate codes for interpretation. A dream of falling didn't signal anxiety, it predicted a loss of status. Bees swarming in a vision meant prosperity, while crumbling teeth foretold imminent death. Monasteries kept dream diaries, recording monks' nocturnal visions as potential divine messages. Even the church, wary of pagan divination, couldn't deny biblical precedents. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel decoding Nebuchadnezzar's visions. If scripture honored dreams, how could mortals ignore them? Practical consequences were staggering. Chroniclers tell of English nobles postponing coronations after ill-omened dreams, fearing rebellion if crowned under a bad sign. Physicians consulted dream accounts alongside pulse readings, believing nighttime visions exposed hidden illnesses. In one infamous case, a French bishop ordered a peasant's house burned because the man dreamed of his neighbor as a witch, a vision taken as proof of her guilt. The line between dream and reality blurred so completely that some courts accepted dream testimony as evidence, provided the dreamer was pious enough to be considered a clean vessel for divine messages. But not all dreams were created equal. Distinguishing true visions from demonic illusions became a cottage industry. Manuals advised checking dreamers for signs of grace, or were they fasting before sleep. Had they prayed for protection, dreams that came after feasting or lustful thoughts were likely Satan's deceptions. The most trusted interpreters weren't psychologists but priests and mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, whose own visions were so revered that popes sought her counsel. What's revealing is how this belief mirrored medieval anxieties. Dreams became a way to process the unexplainable plagues, wars, sudden deaths. A mother dreaming of her dead child might be told the vision was real, a fleeting reunion allowed by God's mercy. A farmer seeing withered crops in his sleep could take it as a warning to tithe more generously. In a society with no concept of the subconscious, every symbol carried external meaning, every nightmare a potential spiritual battle. The legacy of this mindset lingers in unexpected ways. Our modern idea of trusting your gut echoes medieval trust in dreams as intuitive truth. Even the habit of keeping a dream journal traces back to those monastic scribes recording visions at dawn. The difference: today we call it self-reflection. Back then, it was survival, a nightly reckoning with forces far beyond human control. A streak of fire splits the night sky over medieval Paris, not a marvel to behold, but a blade of divine wrath pointing straight at the kingdom. When Halley's comet blazed overhead in 1066, chroniclers didn't record awe, they scribbled terror. This wasn't astronomy, it was heaven's telegram, and the message was always dire: war, famine, the fall of kings. Eclipses plunged cities into panic. Their sudden darkness read not as orbital mechanics but as God literally turning his face away. In an age without science to explain the cosmos, every celestial event became a referendum on human behavior, one that demanded immediate action. Take the eclipse of 1239 over England. Monks at St. Albans Abbey recorded townsfolk running through streets with pots and pans, banging them to drive off demons stealing the sun. King Henry III, mid-battle in Wales, reportedly halted his campaign upon hearing the news, fearing the darkness was divine punishment for his aggression. Across Europe, priests ordered emergency masses, nobles freed prisoners as acts of penance, and farmers slaughtered livestock sacrifices to appease whatever sin had triggered the event. The line between sky and earth blurred completely. If the heavens showed disorder, surely chaos would soon reign below. Comets were worse. Their unpredictable appearances made them seem like rogue messengers, bypassing the usual celestial hierarchy. When a comet blazed over Constantinople in 1456, the emperor's astrologers warned it heralded the city's fall. a prophecy that came brutally true when the Ottomans stormed its walls 3 years later. Afterward, survivors swore they'd seen the comet's tail twist into the shape of a scimitar. Even victories could be tainted. William the Conqueror's comet, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, was celebrated by Normans but cursed by the English as proof of God's abandonment at Hastings. The political exploitation of these fears was ruthless. Popes timed excommunications to coincide with eclipses, lending their edicts supernatural weight. Rival kings spread rumors that their enemies' births had been marked by comets, proving their reigns were cursed. In 1485, Richard III's opponents circulated prophecies that a blood-red eclipse foreshadowed his demise, a narrative that stuck after his death at Bosworth Field. Celestial events became PR tools, their interpretations as contested as royal succession. But beneath the panic lay a poignant human urge to find order in chaos. Medieval star charts weren't just scientific tools, they were moral maps with comets scrawled in margins like corrections from a displeased creator. Astronomers like Johannes Kepler, who later debunked these myths, first trained on texts treating eclipses as spiritual barometers. The legacy lingers in our language. Disaster comes from the Latin for bad star, and we still call unexpected tragedies acts of God. What's haunting is how these beliefs turned the sky into a mirror. When people gazed up at a comet's tail, they didn't just see fire, they saw their own dread reflected back, their wars and famines written large across the heavens. Today we watch meteor showers with wonder, but 700 years ago, humanity looked up and flinched, bracing for whatever judgment the cosmos might hurl down next. A knock at your door after sunset in the Middle Ages wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a test of your soul. To turn away a weary traveler wasn't merely bad manners, it risked divine retribution, for who knew if that ragged figure might be Christ himself in disguise. This wasn't hyperbole. Medieval sermons repeated Christ's warning from the Gospel of Matthew. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Hospitality wasn't kindness, it was a sacred contract between the mortal and the divine, woven into the fabric of daily life. Monasteries led by example, their doors never locked, their hospices offering 3 nights of shelter to anyone beggar, noble, or leper. The rule of Saint Benedict mandated that guests be received as Christ, with monks washing their feet in a ritual echoing the Last Supper. But this duty extended far beyond religious houses. Village homes kept guest corners with straw pallets ready, while castle halls set extra plates at mealtimes just in case. In a world without inns or police, refusing shelter wasn't just cruel, it could condemn a traveler to wolves, bandits, or the vengeful fae folk lurking in forests after dark. Yet this system thrived on vulnerability. Con artists exploited the custom, spinning sob stories to win free meals. Pardoners peddled fake relics, while king's messengers demanded horses and coin. The tension between faith and suspicion played out in folklore, tales like Saint Julian the Hospitaller, where a man unknowingly shelters his parents' murderer, testing the limits of Christian forgiveness. Even laws reflected the dilemma. English statutes required aid for wayfarers, but also warned against sturdy beggars feigning need. The darker side emerged during crises. When famine struck, desperate mobs roamed roads, overwhelming villagers' ability to feed them. Some hosts resorted to subtle tests, offering bread crusts first to gauge gratitude, or watching to see if a guest prayed before eating. Fail these unspoken trials, and you might find yourself back on the road by dawn. What's striking is how hospitality doubled as social currency. A lord's reputation hinged on his hall's generosity, mead flowing, minstrels performing, the poor fed at his gates. The Icelandic sagas brim with feuds sparked by failed hospitality. like the chieftain who lost allies after serving stale fish. Conversely, Saracen chroniclers marveled at crusaders who spared enemies offering bread, seeing it as sacred protection. This belief left fingerprints on modern culture. The word host shares roots with hostia, the Eucharistic bread, a remnant of when feeding strangers was sacramental. Our lingering guilt when ignoring homeless people, that's the medieval conscience whispering that every face could be divine. The system wasn't perfect, but in an era of mud-slicked roads and wolf howls, it meant no one had to face the night alone. In medieval Europe, every bite of food carried more than flavor, it carried the weight of your soul. Gluttony wasn't just a bad habit, it was one of the 7 deadly sins, a gateway to moral decay that could damn you as surely as theft or murder. This wasn't about counting calories, it was about salvation. A peasant gorging on bread after a famine might seem harmless today, but back then, his full belly could be proof of a weak spirit, a failure to master earthly desires in preparation for heavenly judgment. The Church's teachings on gluttony were shockingly specific. It wasn't just how much you ate, but how you ate it, wolfing down food too eagerly, sin. Preferring rich meats to humble vegetables, sin. Even eating at the wrong times, like breaking a fast early, could land you in trouble. Monasteries took this to extremes. Benedictine rules required monks to eat in silence while listening to scripture, turning meals into acts of worship. A single monk caught savoring his cheese too obviously might be assigned extra prayers as penance. But here's the twist: medieval people loved feasting. Banquets were displays of power and piety, with nobles serving 20-course meals to honor saints' days. The solution: a meticulous balance between indulgence and restraint. The liturgical calendar dictated over 100 fasting days a year, no meat on Fridays, strict abstinence during Lent, creating a rhythm where feasts were earned through deprivation. This wasn't just discipline, it was a spiritual seesaw where every bite of salted pork after Easter tasted of both pleasure and hard-won virtue. The health implications were profound. While the rich might suffer gout from overindulgence on feast days, the poor often swung between starvation and sudden gluts, their bodies mirroring the spiritual extremes preached from pulpits. Physicians like Hildegard of Bingen prescribed diets based on humoral theory, warning that overeating hot foods like pepper could literally stoke the fires of lust. Even table manners became moral lessons. Knives were blunted at feasts to discourage violence, and sharing trenchers, thick bread slices used as plates, taught communal responsibility. Waste nothing, take no more than your share, and always leave crumbs for the poor at the gates. What's fascinating is how these beliefs shaped culture. Carnival, the wild festival before Lent, wasn't just partying, it was a sanctioned release valve, a way to get the gluttony out before 40 days of fish and repentance. Cookbooks from the era often included prayers alongside recipes, framing cooking as sacred labor, and the very idea of comfort food traces back to medieval infirmaries where monks served spiced wine and soft bread to the sick, not just for nourishment, but because gentle meals were thought to calm sinful urges. The echoes linger in modern habits. Ever feel guilty for skipping the gym or overindulging at a holiday meal? That's the medieval conscience whispering in your ear. Our cheat days and cleanses are secular cousins to the fast and feast cycle, proof that the line between body and soul has always been blurrier than we think. The difference: today we fret about waistlines. Back then, they were measuring something far heavier, the weight of a sin that could tip the scales of eternity. A peasant woman gathering herbs at dawn wasn't just collecting medicine, she was walking a knife's edge between healer and heretic. In medieval Europe, the difference between a healing poultice and a witch's brew often came down to who was watching and whose approval you had. Folk magic, the everyday spells, charms, and remedies passed down through generations, was a lifeline for villages without physicians. But the moment these practices veered too far from church doctrine, they became a one-way ticket to the stake. What made a remedy acceptable? If it used rosemary and prayer, it might be tolerated. Add a whispered incantation or a suspiciously knotted string, and suddenly you're not easing pain, you're trafficking with demons. Take the humble ligature, a charm to stop bleeding. Tying a cloth around a wound with a prayer to Saint Blaise are perfectly orthodox. But if someone claimed the power came from reciting words backward or burying a nail at a crossroads, that same act became sorcery. The line was terrifyingly arbitrary. Midwives faced constant suspicion, their knowledge of birth herbs and emergency procedures seen as either divine gifts or evidence of pacts with the devil. A Suffolk woman in the 1400s was accused of witchcraft simply because her headache cure, a blend of feverfew and honey, worked too well, leading neighbors to whisper she must have unnatural help. The church's fear wasn't just about superstition. Folk magic threatened their monopoly on spiritual authority. If a village wise woman could cure sickness with rhymes and roots, why tithe to the parish for holy water? This tension birthed manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, which explicitly linked folk healers to Satan, warning that even benign-seeming charms could be demonic traps. The consequences were hideously disproportionate. In one German town, an elderly midwife was burned because she used a folk rhyme to ease childbirth, a rhyme that included the line, "Christ's blood heal thee," but was deemed too pagan for invoking blood magic. Yet folk magic persisted, often hiding in plain sight. Cunning folk operated in a grey market, offering services under the guise of Christian piety. A love potion became holy water sprinkled with rose petals. A protection charm morphed into a cross of elder twigs blessed by the priest. Even approved saints took on magical roles. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Anthony for lost items, blurring the line between prayer and spellwork. What's tragic is how this panic preyed on the vulnerable. The same herbal knowledge that made a widow valued in peacetime made her a target when crops failed. Records from the Basque Country show healers accused of causing storms they'd previously been praised for averting. The ultimate irony, many witchcraft techniques, like using willow bark for pain, a natural source of salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, were genuine medicine, lost for centuries because sharing them risked execution. The legacy of this fear lingers in our language. Hex comes from the German for witch, but originally meant to heal. Even today, calling something old wives' tale carries a whisper of medieval suspicion. The real horror isn't that people believed in magic. It's that they couldn't tell the difference between kindness and conspiracy, between a neighbor's compassion and a devil's bargain. In the end, the church's war on folk magic didn't just burn witches. It scorched away centuries of practical wisdom, leaving villages poorer in every sense of the word. A noble's veins didn't just carry blood, they carried the weight of divine approval. In medieval Europe, the idea of blue blood wasn't a metaphor, it was gospel. People believed God himself had ordained the social order, and noble lineages were his chosen vessels, their superiority written into their very flesh. This wasn't vanity, it was theology. Kings claimed descent from biblical figures or mythical heroes, their bloodlines tracing back to Eden itself. When William the Conqueror took England in 1066, he didn't just seize land, he argued his ancestry through a great-great-grandfather who'd supposedly sheltered the Virgin Mary, gave him a holy right to rule. Marriages became sacred geometry, carefully calculated to preserve this celestial blueprint. Alliances between royal houses weren't just political, they were acts of spiritual preservation. The Habsburgs took this to extremes, intermarrying so obsessively their famous jawline became a genetic warning sign. But even minor nobles followed the logic. Mixing with commoners wasn't just socially taboo, it risked diluting God's favor. Records from 12th century France show lords annulling marriages when brides were discovered to have tainted ancestry, as if nobility could be measured like the purity of gold. The consequences for overreaching peasants were brutal. When a wealthy merchant's son in 14th century Ghent married a baron's daughter, the family was fined into ruin and the bride cloistered in a nunnery, not for love but to cleanse her polluted bloodline. Sumptuary laws policed class boundaries visually, forbidding commoners from wearing silks or ermine, as if fabric could guard genetic sanctity. Even miracles got filtered through this lens. When Joan of Arc, a peasant girl, led armies, theologians scrambled to explain how God could bypass divine bloodlines, some claiming she must have had secret noble ancestry. Yet the system's fragility was its own undoing. Plagues and wars wiped out noble families, forcing kings to elevate commoners, then hastily graft them onto mythical genealogies. The Church, meanwhile, preached that all souls were equal before God, creating tension when low-born saints like Catherine of Siena gained influence. By the late Middle Ages, rich merchants flaunted their wealth in endowments and art, their patronage quietly rewriting the rules of divine favor. The echoes linger in phrases like old money or well-bred, remnants of a time when blood wasn't just biology, it was destiny written in ink and iron. What's chilling isn't that they believed this, but how a drop of common blood could outweigh a lifetime of merit, and how fiercely they clung to the idea that inequality wasn't man's doing but heaven's. A corpse buried without the proper rites wasn't just a tragedy, it was a ticking time bomb. In the Middle Ages, death didn't always mean the end, and the line between rest and unrest was terrifyingly thin. Ghosts weren't spectral figures for campfire tales, they were neighbors who refused to stay gone, revenants clawing their way back to settle scores or finish unfinished business. These weren't fantasies, they were genuine fears that shaped burial customs, inspired laws, and sent villagers digging up graves to stab corpses through the heart with iron stakes. Take the case of William of Newburgh's Chronicles from 12th century England, where he recounts a blood-sucking revenant terrorizing a village. The corpse, exhumed weeks after burial, was found plump and ruddy, its shroud chewed through. The solution: a priest recited prayers while locals hacked the body to pieces and burned it, a grisly but necessary act to protect the living. Similar stories peppered Europe. In Denmark, nightwalkers haunted battlefields. In Germany, Nachtzahrers chewed their burial shrouds, spreading plague with every bite. The undead weren't universal, they were hyper-local, reflecting each region's deepest fears. But why this obsession? Because medieval death was messy. Plagues left mass graves where victims couldn't be identified, let alone given last rites. Suicides, criminals, and unbaptized babies were buried at crossroads or under cairns, their souls trapped in limbo. A body buried face down might rise as a draugar, while a person who died mid-oath could return to fulfill it. The rituals weren't just superstition, they were psychological first aid, giving mourners control over the uncontrollable. The Church walked a tightrope. While theologians insisted souls went straight to heaven, hell, or purgatory, they couldn't stamp out folk beliefs. Instead, they co-opted them. Exorcisms for haunted houses, blessed earth for graveyards, even the practice of weighing down corpses with stones, all were ways to channel primal fears into sanctioned rites. The dead had to stay dead or the social order crumbled. What's chilling is how these fears mirrored very real threats. A revenant spreading disease might have been a corpse improperly buried, contaminating water. Ghosts demanding debts repaid could have been living heirs exploiting superstition to collect, and the stake through the heart, a macabre insurance policy against grave robbers or wolves digging up the dead. The legacy lingers in our Halloween traditions, warding off spirits with jack-o'-lanterns, or the universal fear of burial alive, but it also reveals something profound about grief. When medieval people staked a loved one's corpse, they weren't just fearing the undead, they were pleading with them to rest, to let go, because in a world where death was constant, the greatest terror wasn't dying. It was being left behind. A pilgrim returning from a long journey didn't just bring back stories, they wore their proof on their hat, cloak, or even sewn into their shoes. These tiny metal emblems, stamped with images of saints or sacred sites, were more than just medieval fridge magnets. Pilgrim badges pulsed with spiritual electricity, acting as both divine armor and bragging rights. Imagine walking through a crowded marketplace with a scallop shell from Santiago de Compostela dangling from your belt. That wasn't decoration. It was a force field against misfortune, a wearable prayer that whispered to the world, "I've touched the holy, and some of its power clings to me." The craftsmanship was surprisingly sophisticated for mass-produced charms. Badges from Canterbury featured St. Thomas Becket's martyrdom, his head split by a sword in eerie detail. Rome's badges showed Saints Peter and Paul holding miniature versions of the city, while Jerusalem ones depicted the empty tomb of Christ, but the real magic lay in their materials. Many were made from white metal, a mix of tin and lead, but others contained something far more precious: dust. Pilgrims would rub badges against shrine relics, believing the contact transferred holiness like spiritual static cling. Some even scratched off bits of the badges to mix into medicine or sprinkle on fields, turning faith into fertilizer. What's fascinating is how these trinkets democratized divinity. A peasant who'd saved for years to reach a shrine could wear the same badge as a duke, their shared symbols momentarily flattening social hierarchies. The badges also served as medieval proof of travel. In an era without photos or passports, they were the only way to show you'd truly made the journey. Cheapskates who bought counterfeits from roadside vendors risked more than embarrassment without the shrine's blessing. The badge was just cold metal. But the badges weren't just spiritual, they were social media. Their imagery spread cults of saints faster than any sermon. A badge from Walsingham showing the Virgin Mary holding a lily-inspired copycat pilgrimages after rumors spread that wearers escaped shipwrecks. The badges also sparked the earliest tourism economies. Shrines hired artisans to design new variants annually, creating collectible series that kept pilgrims coming back. Some even functioned as medieval merit badges. Earning a full set from Rome's 7 major churches was the equivalent of leveling up your holiness. Yet these tiny tokens had a dark side. The same badges that protected wearers could mark them for theft. Highwaymen lurked near shrines, knowing pilgrims carried coins, and that a Canterbury badge might mean a fat purse from selling wool to fund the trip. The church also grew uneasy as badges blurred into amulets. When some pilgrims started wearing them instead of attending Mass, priests warned that faith shouldn't fit in a pin. The legacy of these badges hides in plain sight. Ever buy a souvenir keychain from a monument or touch a lucky statue? That's the pilgrim badge instinct, the longing to carry a piece of the sacred home. Today's challenge coins, military patches, even concert wristbands all trace back to those medieval wayfarers who knew a simple truth. Sometimes the smallest objects hold the biggest power, not because of what they are, but because of where they've been. In medieval Europe, resting too long wasn't just a personal choice. It was an open invitation to the devil himself. Sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins, wasn't merely about skipping chores. It was a spiritual rot that could unravel the soul. The church taught that idleness bred temptation, and temptation led straight to hell. A farmer napping under a tree instead of tending his field wasn't just lazy, he was gambling with eternal damnation. This fear transformed work into something far bigger than survival. It became a sacred duty, a way to armor yourself against evil. Monasteries embodied this ideal most starkly. Benedictine rules divided every hour between prayer and labor because empty time was dangerous time. Monks copied manuscripts, brewed ale, or tilled gardens not just for sustenance, but because the rhythm of work kept demons at bay. Even their Latin motto, ora et labora, pray and work, affirmed productivity as piety. But this wasn't confined to cloisters. Village priests preached that the sweat on a blacksmith's brow or the calluses on a weaver's hands were signs of grace, proof they were resisting sin's pull. The practical consequences were everywhere. Guilds enforced strict work hours, fining members for laziness. Towns passed laws against idlers, who could be whipped or jailed for loitering. In Florence, officials patrolled taverns during daylight, dragging able-bodied drinkers back to their workshops. Even leisure had rules. Festivals were sanctioned respites, but wandering minstrels might be chased out if they stayed too long, lest their songs tempt people away from labor. What's fascinating is how this belief birthed early capitalist values. Merchants justified wealth as God's reward for diligence, while the poor were often seen as morally suspect hadn't their poverty sprung from sloth. Protestant reformers like Calvin later turbocharged this idea, but its roots were medieval. In ledgers from 14th century Bruges, traders recorded profits alongside prayers, as if each coin earned was a brick in their heavenly mansion. Yet the system had cracks. Some mystics like the Beguines chose voluntary poverty, arguing that too much work for wealth could also corrupt. Peasants whispered folktales of lazy heroes outsmarting greedy lords, a quiet pushback against relentless toil. And when the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, survivors suddenly found their labor valuable enough to demand higher wages, a shock to elites who'd long claimed hard work was its own reward. The echoes of this belief still shape us. Ever feel guilty for binge watching a show instead of being productive? That's the medieval conscience whispering that rest isn't neutral, it's a moral choice. Our modern hustle culture didn't invent the idea that worth is tied to work. It just swapped saints for CEOs, turning time management into a new kind of salvation. The difference: back then they feared hellfire. Today we fear irrelevance, but the treadmill never really stopped spinning. A newborn's first cry in the Middle Ages wasn't just a sign of life, it was a race against the clock. In a world where infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, the fear wasn't just losing a child, but losing their soul. Unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven, taught the church. Instead, they'd linger in limbo, a shadowy borderland between paradise and hell, never feeling God's presence but spared eternal flames. This wasn't abstract theology. It was a visceral terror that turned every childbirth into a spiritual emergency. Midwives became covert theologians, armed with more than birthing herbs. Many carried small vials of holy water, ready to perform emergency baptisms if a baby arrived weak or premature. The rite was shockingly simple, just a sprinkle of water and the words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," but its weight was cosmic. Some went further, whispering baptisms over visibly healthy newborns just in case. After all, what mother would risk her child's eternity on the hope that the priest would arrive before a sudden fever? The church officially frowned on these lay baptisms, insisting only ordained clergy should perform the sacrament. But everyone from bishops to peasants knew the truth. When a baby gasped its first breath in a freezing cottage miles from the parish church, doctrine mattered less than desperation. Manuscripts like the Sarum Manual quietly acknowledged this reality, giving midwives precise wording to use in emergencies. It was a rare loophole in medieval religion, a silent agreement that when it came to salvation, rules could bend. The grief of losing an unbaptized child left scars deeper than doctrine. Parents buried these babies in unconsecrated ground, often at crossroads or under trees, barred from the churchyard's hallowed soil. Some snuck their children's bodies into cemeteries at night, risking punishment to give them even a stolen patch of holiness. Folklore brims with stories of ghostly infants, the Candelaria of Germany or the Aquila of Spain, wandering as spectral reminders of this theological cruelty. What's haunting is how this belief weaponized parental love. Wealthy families paid priests to be on call for births, while the poor might carry newborns through blizzards to the font. In 1620 France, a couple was fined for baptizing their stillborn in secret, their crime not the act itself, but denying the priest his fee. The system preyed on the vulnerable twice over, first with fear, then with coin. Yet traces of rebellion lingered. Folk customs offered clandestine comfort, hanging hawthorn over cradles to ward off sudden death, or placing a drop of milk on a dying infant's lips as a makeshift baptism. Some mothers whispered their own blessings, trusting God's mercy over clerical decree. The Church's eventual softening, introducing limbo of infants as a gentler alternative to hell, came too late for countless families who'd already mourned in silence. This wasn't just medieval superstition. It was the collision of love and terror, where the purest human instinct to protect a child met the unfathomable stakes of eternity. Today's baptismal ceremonies may feel like tradition, but 700 years ago, they were lifelines thrown across an abyss with tiny souls hanging in the balance. The sky darkens with the smoke of burning villages, and the air fills with the wails of plague victims. To medieval eyes, these weren't just tragedies. They were billboards announcing the end of the world. Apocalyptic dread wasn't confined to fire and brimstone preachers. It seeped into every layer of society, turning ordinary disasters into divine previews. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe in the 14th century, many didn't see a biological catastrophe. They saw the four horsemen galloping through their streets. This wasn't passive fear. It was a lens through which people interpreted everything from eclipses to economic collapse, convinced each crisis brought them one step closer to Judgment Day. Art became a fever dream of doom. Church frescoes depicted the Last Judgment in grotesque detail, sinners swallowed by Leviathan's jaws, the righteous trembling as Archangel Michael weighed their souls. The Dies Irae chant sung at funerals warned of the day when even the just will barely be secure. Even the vibrant colors of stained glass carried coded messages, red for Christ's return in glory, black for the abyss awaiting the damned. People didn't just admire these works, they lived beneath them, their eyes tracing the painted flames as if memorizing a roadmap to eternity. Literature fed the frenzy. Manuscripts like the Apocalypse of Angers wove biblical prophecies into current events, claiming Charlemagne's wars fulfilled Revelation's visions. Travelers brought tales of the mythical Prester John, a Christian king supposedly amassing armies in the east to fight the Antichrist. When Genghis Khan's Mongols stormed Europe in the 13th century, some monks actually welcomed them, believing these barbarians were the prophesied scourges sent to purify Christendom before its final triumph. But the most striking consequence, how this belief reshaped daily behavior. Farmers sowed extra crops just in case the end delayed another year. Merchants drafted wills before short journeys, unsure if they'd live to see sunset. Pilgrims flooded Jerusalem, hoping to witness Christ's return from the very spot he'd ascended. Even financial records reveal eerie details, like the Florentine banker who abruptly liquidated his assets in 1348, convinced the plague was the great winnowing foretold in Matthew. The church walked a tightrope with this terror. While sermons stoked fear of the end to encourage piety, they also had to curb outright panic. When wild-eyed mystics like Joachim of Fior predicted exact dates for the apocalypse, bishops swiftly condemned them, not because the end wasn't coming, but because timing it was God's prerogative alone. This tension birthed bizarre contradictions. Bishops auctioning indulgences to fund crusades, marketed as battles against the Antichrist's forces, even as theologians penned tracts urging calm. What's haunting is how these fears mirrored genuine instability. In a world without antibiotics, reliable harvests, or stable governments, the idea of an imminent end offered a grim comfort. If suffering had a purpose, if every war and famine was a birth pang of the new creation, then pain wasn't random. It was part of a story with a triumphant ending. The legacy lingers in our own doomsday obsessions, climate change panic, Y2K fears, even zombie apocalypse drills. The difference: medieval people didn't just fret about the end. They prepared for it by building cathedrals meant to last millennia, scribing manuscripts they believed angels might one day read. Their terror was edged with hope that when the final trumpet sounded, they'd be counted among the redeemed. And in that hope, they found the courage to keep living even as they watched for the skies to split open. From kings kneeling before sacred relics to peasants whispering charms over their crops, these 22 beliefs weren't just ideas, they were the invisible architecture of an entire era. What seems like superstition to us was, for medieval people, as real as the ground beneath their feet. The weight of an oath could decide a kingdom's fate. The alignment of planets dictated surgical procedures, and a neighbor's envy might literally curse your livestock. Yet peel back the strangeness, and you'll find something startlingly familiar: human beings trying to make sense of a chaotic world. Some of these beliefs have faded into folklore, like the terror of comets or the meticulous tracking of humors. Others never really left us, ever hesitated before breaking a promise, or felt a pang of guilt when skipping work. That's the medieval conscience still whispering in your ear. The fear of gossip morphing into reputation, ruining rumors. They'd call that the evil eye's modern cousin. Even our obsession with productivity echoes the medieval dread of sloth as a soul-crushing sin. The tools have changed, but the impulses remain, proof that culture doesn't just shape beliefs. It sculpts the very way we experience being human. What's most revealing isn't how backward these ideas seem, but how logical they were within their world. Without germ theory, blaming illness on curses wasn't ignorance, it was problem-solving. In an era of constant peril, believing saints intervened in daily life offered control where none existed. And when death lurked around every corner, Purgatory gave grief a language, a way to keep caring for loved ones beyond the grave. These weren't delusions, they were survival strategies forged in the crucible of uncertainty. So which belief lingers most vividly for you? The dramatic terror of the undead rising to settle unfinished business, or the quiet power of hospitality where every stranger might be divine? Maybe it's the unsettling ease with which accusations of witchcraft spiraled into mass panic, a reminder of how quickly fear can eclipse reason. Whatever resonates, these medieval mindsets invite us to question our own invisible frameworks. What unexamined beliefs guide your choices today? History isn't just about dates and battles, it's about understanding the rhythms of thought that shaped lives. If this journey through medieval minds has sparked your curiosity, there's so much more to explore. From the secrets of ancient empires to the unsung heroes of forgotten revolutions, the past is full of stories waiting to surprise you. Hit that subscribe button to join me as we keep unraveling them, one fascinating thread at a time. And don't forget to share which of these 22 beliefs stuck with you. Your insight might just be the start of another incredible conversation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember, the strangest ideas often reveal the deepest truths about who we are.